Art 2. Hard work. As I have mentioned already, we seem to care much less about whether work is successful or effective, whether and how well it works, in the sense that it actually achieves the ends assumed to be projected for it, than about whether the work is real, which is to say whether it works in the alternative sense that it counts for us as work. Work, to be real, or at least realistic, must be what we call hard. This is a strange conception, though it jumps together vigorously with other, even more general assumptions, like the bracing and repeatedly cited claim made by Frederick Jameson that history is what hurts, it is what refuses desire and sets inexorable limits. This is, if not exactly nonsense on stilts, then at least in teetering heels. Why on earth would history be thought to exclude circuses, panettone and the frolics of cultural theory? We can certainly admit that limit, extremity, and other phenomena of improbable ultimacy do tend to be regarded as more essential and defining than average or highly probable conditions, but it is hard to think of convincing reasons for this predilection. We must suspect that an excitable thumb is pressing on the scale, a thumb impelled by a need for excitement. To believe that history is what hurts amounts to believing that history is whatever you see on the news. The idea that history, or rather real history, as opposed perhaps to mere history, should hurt is of a piece with the idea that realism will characteristically be gritty, rather than, say, gooey. The hardness of hard work is obviously metaphorical, though it is a metaphor that draws deeply on certain kinds of non-metaphorical experience that might be characteristic both of work and of suffering. In fact, we are going to see that work is not just accidentally characterized by hardness, since hardness would need to be defined as the need for work. Oh dear! It will neither be the first nor the last of the tautologies that will characterize work by the time I have done here. Hardness has a certain reputation for embodying indubitability, as in James Boswell's account of Samuel Johnson's response to being told that Bishop Berkeley's theory of the pure ideality of matter, though evidently untrue, was very hard to refute. I never shall forget the alacrity with which Johnson answered, striking his foot with mighty force against a large stone, till he rebounded from it. I refute it thus. The fact that Boswell might very well have performed precisely the same action in defense of the proposition of which Johnson performs his defiance is an indication of the shiftily elusive quality of hardness under close inspection. Johnson's contemporary, Thomas Reid, for example, is struck by the fact that the sensation of hardness seems to have nothing in common with what qualifies the objects that we feel to be hard as hard, namely, a condition in which the parts of a body adhere so firmly that it cannot easily be made to change its figure. We are so used to attending to what the sensation seems to evidence or allow us to infer about the object of which it is the sensation, that we find it very hard to pay attention to the nature of the sensation itself. There is, no doubt, a sensation by which we perceive a body to be hard or soft. This sensation of hardness may easily be had by pressing one's hand against the table and attending to the feeling that ensues, setting aside, as much as possible, all thought of the table and its qualities, or of any external thing. But it is one thing to have the sensation, and another to attend to it, and make it a distinct object of reflection. The first is very easy, the last, in most cases, extremely difficult. Reed goes on to claim that it is so difficult to attend to this sensation that nobody, least of all, perhaps, the philosophers whose business it might be thought to be, has even attempted it. It is indeed strange that a sensation which we have every time we feel a body hard, and which, consequently, we can command as often and continue as long as we please, a sensation as distinct and determinate as any other, should yet be so much unknown, as never to have been made the object of any thought and reflection, nor to have been honored with a name in any language that philosophers, as well as the vulgar, should have entirely overlooked it, or confounded it with that quality of bodies which we call hardness, to which it has not the least similitude. We know that things are hard, and we know what hardness consists of in such objects. Pleasingly, perhaps, hardness consists in a certain principle of what we call consistency. What we do not know, Reed insists, is how the sensation we call hardness permits us to infer that hardness. This is a more general difficulty than Reed seems at this point to allow, for it is in fact generally the case that sensations need not, and usually do not, have any resemblance or natural relation to the qualities of which they are sensings. The auditory sensation of a high note does not feel like an accelerated vibration, unless transmitted buzzingly through the reed of a clarinet, say. Reed does not doubt that there is a connection between feeling things to be hard and their having the qualities of hardness, but he cannot account for it beyond the frankly rather flimsy suggestion that there may just be a natural relation between the two. I see nothing left but to conclude that, by an original principle of our constitution, a certain sensation of touch both suggests to the mind the conception of hardness and creates the belief of it, or, in other words, this sensation is a natural sign of hardness. When it comes to work, we are not directly concerned with physical sensation, though it seems very likely that something to do with what we think of as hardness in the objects of sense is powerfully operative in the idea of hard work. But some of the same difficulties seem to arise in accounting for what might be meant by the kind of hardness that we seem to feel is the essential and defining condition of work as such. We know that work is hard when it seems hard, by which we seem to mean when we feel. We cannot deny its hardness, or that there can be no argument about it. But I hope what has been said so far has softened my reader up sufficiently to recognize that we may not know as well as we suppose what that hardness is. The work performed by the idea of hardness is to seem to refute that unknowing through some means other than thought or representation. As may be suggested by the attention paid by recent philosophers to the conundrum of hardness for reed, hardness is not just one quality among others, but one that has a generally representative status. This representative status comes not from a quality inhering in the kind of hard object for which Johnson's stone is taken to be paradigmatic, but an assumed or projected relation between the stone and its perceiver. I think we can assume that the reason why hardness seems to have the representative quality it does is that it seems to resist us in a way that other qualities, like figure and color, do not. We do not have to do any work to understand immediately that lifting a heavy weight or attempting to dropkick an embedded stone will entail a lot of work, mighty force, in Boswell's description. Reed affirms that his idea of hardness in a body is the conception of such a cohesion of its parts as requires great force to displace them. In other words, the hardness of something is the measure of what we call, confusingly, perhaps, the hardness of the work required to change its position or disposition. The primary conception of the hard is that of something that is intractable or that will not easily yield. Boswell's manuscript makes it clear that the stone against which Johnson launched his foot was in fact one of the large projecting stones of the building from which they had just emerged, a church in Helvoetsluis in the Netherlands. But by not yielding easily to work, hardness yields it up, or delivers it to awareness. Something hard stands out, stands up for itself. Let us recall the question of why realism might seem more obviously gritty than, say, gooey or gaseous. It cannot be because grit is any more material than gloop or gossamer, though something in the way we think of matter, or the relation between ourselves and it, seems unrestingly and irresistibly to weight us towards this view. I surmise that it is because we have inherited an ergological view of matter as that against which we must strive, and it is therefore primarily characterized in modes of tractability or yieldingness. Hardness is not an absolute indwelling condition of things, for something that is hard for a finger may be soft as butter for a tungsten blade. Hardness is therefore an inferred or assumed relation, a relation that seems to imply an opposition between an active user and an inert material, more or less available for use, arrangement or derangement. If the very relation between matter, nature reduced, as it were, to physics and human life is seen as a relation of potential antagonism, it may be because the complement to an ergological view of matter is an ergological ego of work, or what Gaston Bachelard, following Manet de Biran, described as a cogito of striving. The self-sensing of such an ego, the way in which its being seems to be for itself, is as something that surges up spontaneously out of inertness, but is able thereby to stand up against it, in both a visual and an energetic sense, yet at the same time only seems to be able to come into being in reaction to the pressing in of inertness upon it. Inert is from Latin inus, inerus, without art or work, either in the sense of being unworked or being itself incapable of working. But the interior reference to work means that inertness, like hardness, is never entirely inert, since it can impart or permit the demand that work be done. Alternatively, in Jean-Paul Sartre's category of the practico-inert, matter can appear as the sedimentation of human efforts of adaptation or transformation, making matter what Sartre calls worked inertia, or the artifact of past action. It is hard to be sure whether the seriousness of the idea of work derives from striving and struggle, or striving and struggle become serious by being reimagined as a kind of work. Perhaps in both cases the trick is turned by the imaginary transvaluation of suffering into willed purpose, subjection, thereby being subjectified. In both cases, the phantasmagoria of seriousness depends upon the conversion of everything that is indifferently or inertially other than the self into its invigorating negative. Negativity works neutral adjacencies up into forms of work relation. For there are two kinds of negative, that which is indifferently not, and that which says no, or to which we ourselves say no. The first is tolerative, the second privative. The first is part of an infinite, non-aggregating, non-interfering sum of adjacencies, the defect prospect of things sub specie aeternitatis, or under what William Empson calls the big top of the historical approach. If I contemplate my coffee cup, I can easily denominate hosts of things which it is not and which I am therefore unlikely to mistake for it, my cat, the carpet, the Berlin Wall and the doctrine of transubstantiation. There is, in fact, no limit to all the things that the coffee cup is trivially not, as an obvious but uninteresting condition of its being a coffee cup. The second kind of negative forms a zero-sum game, and is the kind of thing that quarrelsome primates, subsisting in a world of scarce resources, and the assault and battery of nothing buttery, one thing or the other, and either with us or against us, tend to get very het up about existing, in fact, in a permanent state of pre-excitement about the prospect of such excitement. Empson suggested something like this difference in observations regarding the practice of literary criticism in 1950. There is a tendency to feel that, if the critic is offering a really efficient machine, it ought to be able to say whether marmalade is better than sausages, but even the most expert cook cannot say that. Sometimes you want one, sometimes the other. This kind of absolutism seems to be comical. The marmalade reappears in a different guise in Empson's comparison a few years later of the theory of the all-including collective unconscious to the jam theory, that we have all human experience inside us, simply as the jam in our tin. The problem, or very likely just one of them, is that any kind of incomparability, however delightfully and peaceably disparate it may appear, can serve to put the desperate competitive machine in gear. The disputational objection that one is illegitimately comparing apples and pears has always struck me as feebly self-defeating, precisely because apples and Peers are so self-evidently comparable and in fact readily confusable, just like chalk and cheese and even, in their assonantal way, hawks and hand sauce. But skipping is not pollen, to name, as much at random as I can manage, just one of the infinite numbers of things that skipping, or pollen, can turn out not to be, forever and ever, once you come to think about it, if you can be bothered. I think it would take a diabolically versatile kind of logico-poetic wangling to make skipping a jaw-thrusting naysaying of pollen, since it does not in any obvious way take pollen's place or gainsay its existence. Come on. What is it to be? Skipping? Or pollen? My readers will already have started imagining for themselves an exotic conceptual scheme in which pollen might indeed be construed as the opposite or antagonist of skipping. For example, it inanely occurs to me as the indicative instances of an imaginary language built around the metaphysical duality of things spelled with a double L, like spelling, and things spelled with a double P. But this is not evidence of any pre-existing pattern of antagonisms, but only of how expert we are at finding ways to turn indifferent unrelatedness into adversary non-relation. That is what I am endeavoring to make my point. Hegel's relation of negation usually does seem to involve this act of negativing, and therefore seems to prompt a self-defensive negation of its negation, making the negative the to be overcome, either through annihilation or the preservative annihilation of assimilation. Perhaps these two modes of the negative themselves exist in a privative relation, so that one might construe Hegel's famous labor of the negative as a labor not just against whatever is constituted as or seems to present itself as negative, but more importantly, a labor against the indifference that is the negation of the negative relation between spirit and whatever it supposes to be its opposite, and by supposing ends it. 15 thought of in this way, the labor of the negative could be understood not as a labor bearing up against something experienced as a negation, distance, want, restriction, interdiction and so on, but as a labor on behalf of the relation of negativity. This is one of the many reasons that argumentative persons, and given the affinity commonly assumed between impersonality and indifference, it is admittedly difficult to imagine any other kind, find equanimity in those they would have be their opponents so enraging and, alas, also agonistically invigorating. Hence the charge of passive aggression, which is what passive persons are often accused of by aggressive ones. The labor of the negative is to keep negativity in being. This is because negativity is an essential feature of the being of human beings, probably as a combined byproduct of raw primate aggressiveness, and the capacity, hugely amplified by language, to remember or project other states of things in a way that seems to keep continuously actual and at-hand states which are no longer or are not yet, thus thronging actual existence with ad hoc inactualities. If seriousness usually concerns the effort to keep things continuously in being, the seriousness of work maintains the importance of keeping effort in being, where effort is linked to the transformation that may be effected by work. Work, definable as the deliberate production by man of changes in matter for the purposes of man, is always a work of transformation, arising from more or less violent repugnance to the given or to things as they are. To work is to strive against givenness, even though work has by now been immutably bricked into the given for human beings. Working is therefore the overcoming of what impedes, or the negation of a negation, for work is also, and much more importantly, the production, preservation and, as we say, elaboration of the very relation of negativity that gives it its stimulus and reason. The English word strive, of uncertain origin, embodies this ambivalence, for it may derive either from Old French estriver, to contend or quarrel, or from Germanic, which has the meaning of endeavor, whatever the origin. Striving for or towards has long been indistinguishable from striving with or against. Work, then, is war or, more strictly, the waging of war, where waging implies manner, method, strategy, some way of putting it into operation. 2. Wage war is in fact to work on war, to transform the raw hurly-burly of the bellum omnium contra arms by the scansion of rules of engagement. 2. Wage and to engage are both variations of French gager and English gauge. To wage, in the sense of performing, carrying on or carrying out, derives from the sense of giving a wager in pledging, the bargain struck by the first strike, and the effort to win. Work, like sport, according to George Orwell, is war minus the shooting. One might take the will to strive to be explicable simply because it is one of the things about which human beings are so immensely serious, meaning that we commit ourselves to it with the same kind of commitment that work requires. But the kind of striving that is made universal in organized labor is not just the object of a particular kind of seriousness, but one of the cardinal modes by which seriousness exists and is made to subsist. That is, work is taken seriously because it is a prime means of producing seriousness. If this is circular, its circularity is not entirely inert. For one does not merely stumble on seriousness, that being precisely the opposite of what it means to be serious about something, one must win through, or beat a path to it. Work is a serious matter, because work is the proof of seriousness, and because the production of seriousness is itself always such a labor of striving, the striving that labor strives to make of itself, in its travail against the trivial. War is the horizon and apotheosis of work, since the work of war requires a supreme effort of concentration and coordination of forces and resources. War requires that work itself be worked up into totality, so that there is no residue of any activity or purpose other than that of the struggle to win the war. Such total mobilization happens rarely, in fact, partly because it is so hugely expensive, but its ideal form haunts ordinary understandings of work. And since the mass mobilizations of the First World War, the ongoing convergence has become ever more complete. Once an entire economy and system of production has been focused on the waging of war. That economic system will always be part of long-term preparation for hostilities. But total mobilizations, which put entire societies on a war footing, are, in fact, a sort of model for other kinds of militant project, religious, economic and political, of which they are the miraculous apparitions and actualizations. It may be the project of redemption for original sin, itself a generative model for many kinds of project. Or it may be the struggle for emancipation from slavery or dominion. Or it may be the more general struggle for some unspecified fulfillment against anything that seems in its mere being to negate that fulfillment. All these irritable or angry reactions require to be embodied in projects in which one simultaneously launches oneself towards some future condition and takes on a kind of subordination to it. The slave who plans an uprising, the worker who pledges themselves to the revolution, the prisoner who digs a tunnel with a spoon, all, in their projects of freedom, actually choose one servitude, the unswervingly obedient service of their freedom, over another. Projection makes the strangely absurd affair of self-aware living in time a serious matter, a matter to which one must make oneself over. And yet, if work is war and war is the essential form of work, there is at least one rather telling anomaly. One Maccabees to records that, in the 2nd century BC, during the Maccabean uprising against the attempts of Antiochus IV to suppress Jewish religious practices, 1,000 Jews were slaughtered when they refused to join battle with the forces of Antiochus on the Sabbath. The followers of the resistance leader immediately determined that, like refusing to care for the sick, this was a suicidally self-contradictory principle that must be abandoned. At that time therefore they decreed, saying, "Whosoever shall come to make battle with us on the Sabbath day, we will fight against him, neither will we die all, as our brethren that were murdered in the secret places." One might have thought this a pretty straightforward clarification, but debate about whether the waging of war is permitted on a Sabbath has lingered, perhaps as a special instance of the continuing attempts to make the warlike lawlike. If it seems obvious that work is always imagined as a warlike kind of struggle, and the conduct of war always requires many different kinds of war work and military operation, there is also something in war which seems opposed to work. For war may be regarded as the most intensely purposive action in which humans engage, especially for those who are defending their lives. Under these circumstances, war is an absolute necessity for survival, as are many other kinds of life and death struggle against fire, flood, famine, and other kinds of natural ills. As such, war must be won, once and for all, in a way that seems completely contrary to the practice of work, which is intended never to be finishable, or not in the absolute way at which war is aimed. To be sure, many human beings have, as we say, made their living as professional soldiers, but the turning of war into work that this practice involves seems to amount to a strange kind of deterrence. All work is a variety of war, even as work is a taming or sedation of the atemporal paroxysms of war into routine. One works, as we say, for a living. Work has the importance it does because it makes merely being into a specific way of being. Work gives meaning because it finitizes what would otherwise be the horror of unstyled, unpurposed existence. Work fulfills but only by reducing living to the instrumentality of living for. Work embodies the projective nature of existence in joining the openness of living for or towards to the inevitable closure of having lived as and for that living for. Work thereby opens up a free future that it is its purpose to foreclose. One works to have been. Work must always therefore be formative, dedicated to the formation of a work. Even and especially the work that the worker must make of himself. To say that my work is fulfilling is to say that it has reduced me to an object without excess, in just the same way as alienating labor is supposed to. One need not mean one's work to function in this way, since it is the function of work to come to be the meaning that one's life has had. There is no escape from this process of working one's life up into some definite form or other, even if one forswears every conceivable kind of ambition or project for existence, for that forswearing will have in the course of time to harden into something that one swears by, as a sacred project of temper or torpor of which our lives cannot fail to have been the working through. The need for work is implied in the condition of a being whose being is a question for itself. Answering the question of being, the question what am I to be, or to have been, means understanding one's being as adversity or ordeal. This makes being a task, or the task of answering to the question of being. To be is to be challenged to be. One may fail in that task of answering, but one cannot avoid answering to that task as a task, since declining the challenge, like Melville's Bartleby, is nonetheless an answer to its demand. This necessity of response to the question of being is what makes work intrinsic to the kind of being characterized as human. To be a human is to live one's being as an affair, something to be done. It is Hegel who formalized the principle that Arbeit matched Frey in labor, which is to say in the assertion of one's will over objective matter, one partially objectifies oneself, voluntarily limiting one's freedom for the period of one's labor. But the products of one's labor serve to enlarge one's freedom from necessity. The solemn exchanges of freedom and limit, life and matter, form a sort of animistic puppet play. Unlike Pinocchio, the wooden-top imitation of life who strives to become a real boy, his father, the craftsman Geppetto, literally little log or block, subdues himself through his labor in order to infuse his life into a lump of wood. Jean-Paul Sartre follows Hegel and the tradition of thinking about labor, which he inaugurates in his account of the mysterious dialectic involved in all labor, or the kind of purposive action for which Sartre uses the magic word praxis. One can say that human labor, the original praxis by which man produces and reproduces his life, is entirely dialectical, its possibility and permanent necessity rest upon the relation of interiority which unites the organism with the environment and upon the deep contradiction between the inorganic and organic orders, both of which are present in everyone. Its primary movement and its essential character are defined by a twofold contradictory transformation. The unity of the project endows the practical field with a quasi-synthetic unity, and the crucial moment of labor is that in which the organism makes itself inert. The man applies his weight to the lever in order to transform the surrounding inertia. That this deadly earnest set of magical interchanges is essentially comic is suggested by the screw-turning Bergsonism of Sartre's formula for the subordination of workers to their work. Man becomes the machine's machine. Militant seriousness is present even in the philosophical understanding of the human body, and specifically in the cathexis of the uprightness that characterize humans, and the serious business it implies of standing one's ground, or standing up to or for things. In its effort to contemplate all this work of time, Tennyson's In Memoriam articulates the poetics of history, turned from vertigo into groaning verticality, till at the last arose the man who throve and branched from clime to clime, the herald of a higher race, and of himself in higher place. If so he typed this work of time within himself, from more to more, or crowned with attributes of woe, like glories, move his course, and show that life is not as idle or but iron dug from central gloom, and heated hot with burning fears, and dipped in baths of hissing tears, and battered with the shocks of doom, to shape and use, arise and fly, the reeling fawn, the sensual feast, move upward, working out the beast, and let the ape and tiger die. To be upright is to assert one's will to negate the ground, and to display the continuing exertion of that willfulness in the doing of one's being. Hegel writes that the upright posture in man continues to be an affair of his persistent will, for the man stands only because and in so far as he wills to stand, and only so long as he wills it without consciousness. No wonder that so many cultures have striven to make such hard work of walking itself, or trained the human body to an uprightness that is a symbol of the spurning of earth, of a stasis ribbed and quivering with flexed will. No wonder, too, that the idea of having to strain every sinew simply to continue in being should so quake with ludicrousness, and that falling over should be the epitome of comedy. What keeps seriousness upright is not its indwelling virtue, but the precipice of absurdity on the brink of which it trembles at once sternly refused and made momently imminent by its efforts of retraction. There is an ambivalence in hardness that has substantial effects on the way in which we think about work. On the one hand, the hard represents the idea of a kind of ultimate and absolute limit as embodied most powerfully in the absolute antagonism between subject and object, the subject being that which is overthrown by the object, that which it is thrown up against. On the other hand, since, as we have seen, hardness is not in fact an absolute and isolate condition, but rather a relation between cohesion and susceptibility, it is also characterized by infinite degrees. The striving to overcome resistance can become the striving to overcome the inert, stony flavor of victory over the inert. In this, work is the striving to make striving absolute, as though it were striving to make itself autonomous of the alien and obdurate exteriority on which it depends for its excitement. Striving makes itself hard in bending the hard to its will, just as work is hard when it struggles to overcome the impediments of hardness. Work is only real work when it is hard work, even though it is always possible to set oneself in opposition to that hardness by working harder. Indeed, to work hard means to try to work even harder than one has hitherto, a built-in escalation that implies the risk that the reality of work may recede infinitely. In order to be work, then, work must be hard, and in order to be hard, work must always strive to work harder, in order to exceed itself, meaning that the limits of hard work are always, like the retreating horizon, soft. Work turns the objects on which it works into what are called works, which seem at once finished and yet to possess the quality of unbroached potential that is characteristic of the artist-craftsman who has made them. Gaston Bachelard was always poised to recognize the ways in which the hard may be worked into softness, worked, as it were, into a working condition, for example in the iron works of the sculptor Eduardo Chillida, in which he discovers the dream of hardness, a muscular space stripped of all fat and heaviness, in which, in other words, the iron has become a kind of self-fashioning body, imitating the shape of the body that has shaped it. If the iron enters of the soul of the blacksmith, then his works may be said to have worked themselves out of purely spatial being and into temporal being. In Chillida's airborne works, which are somewhere between cages and birds, as if cages were on the point of taking wing, Bachelard finds at once a compounding of iron and air and a synthesis of substance and movement, powerful movement finding in iron its proper substance. Work takes time and in the process forges it, which is why, as will later be seen, the time of work must always look forward to a time of redemption, and the perfection of time and work together do as I say. As Marx observes, work must always involve some kind of project. It is just this feature that, for Marx as for many others, distinguishes human work from the operations which seem to resemble it in the natural world and which indeed human beings may often imitate. One works towards some end, which must always imply a gap between a current state and the end projected. We presuppose labor in a form that stamps it as exclusively human. A Spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. There are two aspects to Marx's definition of work. The first is that there must be some kind of reflexive relation between the one who projects an end and the one who effectuates it. The one who works effects a change of form in the material on which he works, but he also realizes a purpose of his own that gives the law to his modus operandi and to which he must subordinate his will. This means close attention. The less he is attracted by the nature of the work and the mode in which it is carried on, and the less, therefore, he enjoys it as something which gives play to his bodily and mental powers, the more close his attention is forced to be. This reflexivity can take shared or collective forms, in which the worker subordinates himself or herself to the realization of an end shared with others, who therefore give themselves a law in common. But the outrage of slavery, or the alienated conditions of labor that approximate it, lies in the fact that it destroys any possibility of that self-relation, since the end towards which the slave works can never be their own end, even in part. The second aspect of work is that it should involve both a gap and the closing of a gap between conception and execution, that is, it should take time. This subordination is no mere momentary act. Besides the exertion of the bodily organs, the process demands that, during the whole operation, the workman's will be steadily in consonance with his purpose. However, if the gap between conception and execution is at its maximum for the slave or other exploited worker, it seems inconceivable that that gap could ever be reduced to nothing, precisely because the projective nature of work involves a conception that includes the requirement of having to be worked towards or worked through a projected end, whether a sonnet, a set of shelves, or a three-course meal, must always include some implicit postponement, some prospect of the work necessary to achieve the projected end that will make it, as we say, worthwhile. Reflexivity and postponement are related aspects of the same condition. For self-relation requires self-division. The attention required can only be maintained by a kind of tensioning of time, in which workers both maintain themselves in their work and yet effect a transformation too, as they accompany the process whereby the work works towards the intended and finally completed work. The necessarily cooperative nature of many human undertakings, necessary because of the unignorable gains in efficiency that cooperation brings, means that the self-division between the worker and the self-monitoring attention that must be paid to himself or herself in the work process is often distributed between those performing the two kinds of work, dryly distinguished by Bertrand Russell, in arguing that work consists either of altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface relatively to other such matter, or, alternatively, telling other people to do so. The question of whether the one who issues the instructions to others to do the work is or is not working has traditionally been a matter of some dispute. When Cleopatra says of Caesar's efforts to persuade her of his magnanimity, in victory, he words me girls, he words me, her words hurdy-gurdy, the word into a kind of work, the work of words that was her author's own. The question of the nature of the work done by the one who directs the work often dramatizes the contrast between the corporeal and conceptual understandings of work, or work's hardware and software. The beginning of Genesis, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, simply and powerfully enacts this magical sense of fiat, the abracadabra be it so of saying things into being. It is more snappily effective in the fiat lux et facta est lux of the Latin Vulgate than in the awkwardly strung out English, which seems to have about it something of the potentate clapping his hands for retainers to scurry about performing the necessary operations. The invocation of the power of poetry in closing the gap between utterance and action is apparent in the slogan introduced to encourage the vigilance of travellers on British railways: "See it, say it, sort it." The idea of the capacity of words to perform a kind of immediate work is at once mystical and one of the most common signs of the onset of serious mental illness. The apparatus of mediated authority is one of the most powerfully cohering and yet also dynamic aspects of the work relation. The names given to those who tell others what to do in a work that they perform on those doing the work seem to indicate that their role is perceptual rather than effectual. Their role is that of horseman to horse, or, in other words, a matter more of seeing than doing. God saw the light, that it was good. Hence terms such as overseer, inspector, supervisor, superintendent, or director. The worker performs the work. The manager has a responsibility to ensure that the work takes the form necessary to its completion. The worker supplies undirected effort. The manager gives it its shape, purpose, intelligibility, or orientation. Work relations thereby provide a physical approximation of the metaphysical relations between force and form. The ambivalence is neatly but amply implied in the word order, which means both to classify and to command, both a desired arrangement and the coercive force required to bring it about. In this case, the primary relation between a willing subject and an inert object is reproduced between different kinds of worker. The idiomatic expression "to order about" shows their convergence, since to direct workers to move from place to place is a kind of mimicry of the work of purposively altering the state of matter that is the essential function of any act of work, and the force it is necessary to apply in order to give anything form or to put it in order. The bowling of the sergeant major on the parade ground represents an abstract diagram of these relations, with the Forceful physicalization of the instruction, a tension seeming to act out that fantasy that the force of the order has literally shoved the soldiers into position, a position that mimics the reduction of a living body into a statue. The sergeant major makes himself over into the image of pure imperative force which, acting directly and immediately on the obedient bodies of the soldiers, makes them into pure, inert form. The OED suggests that the Latin ordo is perhaps cognate with RDR, to lay the work before weaving, to initiate an enterprise on the assumption that the weaving sense was primary, and that RD originally denoted a thread on the loom. This might indicate that ordering, like working itself, is an action spread over time between the openness of initiation, in which an order is given, and the closure of completion, in which some ordering has been achieved. The principles of force and form have sometimes been invoked to distinguish living beings and processes from inanimate ones, or at least to characterize their relation. Thomas Khurrana proposes that the processes that we, following the philosophical discourses around 1800, call living are processes inherently marked by a polarity of force and form. Living is what takes place within this polarity, a dialectics of force and form. It is neither the sheer productive force nor the mere resulting form but a certain interrelation, to be more precise, a tension of force and form. It will usually be possible, in any given circumstance, to distinguish the operations of force and form, the forms of the wheel and piston through which the expansive force of the engine is conveyed, the lozenge of willow that will allow a cricket ball to be propelled rapidly to the boundary. By operations, however, we must mean something that seems to perform the work of force, or something that will appear as a form. The drill sergeant can only act out his pantomime because he is enacting the form of the force. He represents, recalling the fantasy of auditory execution that is satisfyingly laid out in the story of Joshua bringing down the walls of Jericho through the synchronization of trumpets and shouting, and ontogenetically confirmed in the power of the cry to procure comfort and relief that is rediscovered by every baby. The compliant company, on the other hand, can only assume its required form because it is obedient, that is, makes itself an object of hearing, and is capable of internalizing the external force in their movements. The form of force therefore requires the force of form. The fact that forces and forms are in fact both operations rather than objects means that force can never be permanently and definitively distinguished from form. As Khurrana continues, it is of the utmost importance that the form is the form of forces produced by forces and organizing forces, and that the force cannot be thought of independently from form, but rather is a force of forms, producing forms and being itself formed. One may say that this dialectic of force and form characterize not only the realm of the living in general but the realm of the kind of living that self-conscious life makes for itself, and so makes of itself, through work. understood as directed or formative force, or will to form. The form of force and the force of form play across the two meanings, verbal and substantive, of work, as well as the two equivalent meanings of order, the way in which one works to produce a work, and orders a particular ordering of things. Clean up this mess. I will have the mushroom risotto. Work relations are actually an allegory of the larger dialectic of force and form that gives work its character. These relations are a styling or staging of work, the form through which, the mediating through which signaled in the word perform, the force of work is channeled. If work is an ungraspable necessity for humans, it is because it is a will to the forcing of form that cannot itself be conclusively precipitated into form. This is why the only real work must be hard work, a force seeking to bear up against something hard that seems to resist it. Work must be hard because it must strive to realize itself in such a way as always to exceed, or be able to exceed, its own realization. The huge overestimation of mental functions among human beings and the symbolic forms, like written or spoken orders, which those mental functions can so readily take, means that the relations between mental and physical ordering can often assume a magical character. Human beings have never accomplished any feat of invention, construction and organization to match the vast and millennia-long engineering of social life through the practice of work. The strike, which can never be general or anything other than an orgiastic episode, is the sabbatical proof that human life is essentially dedicated to work. The assignment of this present work is to demonstrate that the epic enterprise of human work, by which I mean not what human work has accomplished but the accomplishment of the idea of work itself, is an expression and achievement of magical thinking. The very concept of magical thinking revolves round the idea of work. As the doctrine of the omnipotence of thoughts, the functional principle of magical thinking is that thinking does not merely mirror the world or foreshadow some future condition of it, but performs actual work on it. Magical thinking is the thought that thinking works on the world along with the work that thought does. But the work performed by magical thinking is a cause for concern as well as triumph. The point of magic is that it is undirected power that is capable of working on its own. The patient of Freud who suggested to him the term omnipotence of thoughts was unnerved rather than overjoyed, or said he was, by the power that he believed his thoughts had to cause harm in the world. The thought that thoughts perform work implies both a joyful and exalted sense of power, and the austere sense of the necessity of channeling and tempering that power. So the thought of the thought work of magical thinking gives rise simultaneously to the thought of the work that must be done to master it. Work is too powerful, magical thinking tells itself, to be allowed to work by itself, so it must be put to work. In the horse, sail or mill wheel it is work itself that is worked on. This accounts for the strange ambivalence of magic, which at once allows the thought of things to be had for nothing or nothing but the thinking, or the magical speaking that makes them so, and yet always also seems to require the literal elaboration, or working out of logical systems, theories, techniques and technologies. The very word elaborate seems to imply not just something worked out but a work that threatens to spiral out of control, or into a condition of deceitful vacuity. In most ordinary circumstances, work is a sovereign defense against the temptation of magical thinking, the apparent proof on the muscles and through the sinews that mere thinking or saying will never simply be enough to make it so. At the very same time, the relation between the boss and the worker is a confirmation of the elation of the idea of work as expressed in the fantasy of a command, the fantasy that the real work lies in the imaginary work of conception, government and man-management, without which the real work of striving and straining becomes a vapidly time-serving charade. The distributions of work functions between the master and the slave, the overseer and the operative, the conductor and the performer and the director. And the actor can become a vast distraction as the dynamics of esteem multiply in the space between conception and effectuation that should in principle be as reduced and efficient as possible. At every stage, force and form are driven to change places with each other. The ideal force of work makes what would otherwise be the empty form of the work directive real, putting it into force, but in the process necessarily imparting to that force a kind of form. But the form given to the force of the work always threatens to diffuse that force into the impostures and wasteful distractions of work relations, which must always themselves be managed if they are not to drift into empty formality. The dramaturgy of work relations is the machinery required to make work real, making good the ontological deficit at its heart. With stage business, even as it derealizes the work by deflecting its focus away from its purported outcome, the form that channels a force, enabling it to exert its force, is also what impedes it and diffuses it in friction. At every point, the purpose of the work is on the point of turning into mere purport. It is usually thought that this kind of dissipation is a problem to be solved. The problem solved by work may seem from close up to be how to bring work to an end. However, as the discussion of the history of efforts to imagine and effect redemptions of work in Chapter 5 will conclude, the point of work is not to reduce work but to keep it going, which entails maintaining or if necessary manufacturing its necessity and making sure it is of a kind that will allow it to be experienced as hard in all the unexpectedly complex ways that have emerged in this chapter's discussion. For the time being, that process seems to involve a general move from apparently hard forms of work to soft forms. This is clear not just in the move away from manual labor and industrial processes to more abstract kinds of occupation, or from heavy lifting to bureaucratic sifting. It also involves new, ever more reflexive and densely recursive forms of relation. between force and form, in which the mythical distribution of force and form between the master and the slave is internalized in forms of work ethic and work discipline. Honest toil. Work appears to be a primary and elemental conception, if etymology is a guide. The idea of work, like the word itself, does not seem to appear to be a development of some other, more primary conception, as is the case with many other words. We can assume the existence in Proto-Indo-European of a root, meaning to do, make, shape or build, meaning that to work is to act or do. But work, for all its extraordinary range of applications in English and Germanic languages, is not the only word at work in English for the act of work. As usual, there is a Latinate alternative in the form of labor, along with words like toil and craft. It is in fact a complex task to discriminate the ways in which action can come to be regarded as work. In pastoral writing, Arcadia was often characterized by honest toil and the absence of any kind of guile. To buy real goods with honest toil. Amongst the woods and flocks, to use no guile, was honor to those sober souls that knew no happiness but what from virtue grew. Indeed, the idea that work began honest and was later on corrupted by forms of cheating and dissimulation is a powerful ingredient in ergogony, or the phantasmatics of work's origin. The myth of the fall of work itself. From honesty into deception, alienation, and other kinds of corruption, forms, as it were, a counter-myth to the belief that work arises as a remedy for the fall from felicity, as fallen humans work out their salvation. In fact, it seems likely that, as soon as work became a concept as well as a practice, as soon as it began to be distinguishable from the actions of which it consists, which may be as soon as there are the words like make and do, which appear to be primary in all languages, work entered into a symbolic mesh of meanings, things that work means and things that people mean to do through those meanings. It thus becomes possible for the idea of work to become entangled with the doing of it, meaning that work must from the beginning always be able to be something other than honest toil, pure and simple. Indeed, as with most theories of radical beginnings, the idea of the radical beginning of honest toil has required a great deal of working out and philosophical heavy lifting to be arrived at. This means that the honesty of work really lies in its future, as an unfulfilled dream of self-coincidence. Even as the conceptions of what would count as honesty in work irresistibly become more elaborate, following the historical rule that seems to apply to all radical imaginaries, the ideal of honest work is simultaneously deferred ever further into the future and recedes ever further into an imaginary past. Of simple and self-evident beginnings, the principle of the economy of effort that applies to all entities and organisms means that work always aims to move away from inefficiency and towards greater efficiency, even if this is only on the whole and in the long run, and it is often a very long run indeed. Nobody will persist for long in carrying books from one room to another one-handed when it is possible to carry twice as many using two unless, of course, one is deliberately increasing the amount of work one wishes to do with one hand. As part of a program of training or physiotherapy, in which case a different framework and program of efficiency will have come into play, which will however maintain the principle of economy of effort in a different way. Work aims to effect desirable improvements in the world and must always aim reflexively to improve itself into the bargain. Work must be honest. Work is perhaps honesty itself, or compulsion itself, ghosting the otherwise absent gerund of musting. You must work, but the must of things is the work you are compelled to do. Are speaking of honest toil, of the laborer who is worthy of his hire, makes of the idea of work an ideal of truth, even as it makes for the idea that truth must depend on striving or ordeal. Why? Why the will to truth or the war against error or ignorance? Can work that is not hard really be work? Our language does not seem to make that very easy, even though it is usually indeed much easier to speak of hard work than to do it. The idea of work formally excludes pretense, since simulated work is not supposed to be work at all. And yet that definitional exclusion must always ensure that the question of pretense will be at work, or involve the purposive temporary suspension of purpose we like to call play, when it is a question of work. We might think, for example, of the paradoxical action of refraining from action, known as begging, which institutes a substitutive economy in which idleness becomes an active, even strenuous, form of performance. The animal that begs. Begging being almost as widespread in animals as in humans, must always set the energy costs of their petition, which can be sizable, against the likely gain on their investment in gifts of alimentation or copulative opportunity. Michel Serres' suggestion that history passes from reality to language, from things to signs, and from energy to information, from hard solutions to so-called soft ones, has been formalized in a model suggested by Stephen Hernard, who suggests that language may be understood as a form of symbolic currency that allows us to store up and transmit experience. Just as I can earn money through a lifetime of laboring and then bequeath it to my daughter so that she herself never has to go to work, so language stores up and makes available for time shifting and transmission the knowledge that would otherwise have to be gained repeatedly from the arduous and often costly rough and tumble of experience, or school of hard knocks. Hernard describes this process as symbolic theft because it allows us to steal categories through hearsay instead of having to earn them through the honest toil of learning them from direct exposure and trial and error. Feedback from the consequences of miscategorization. Hernard maintains that symbols must always be grounded in the sensori-motor interaction with the things that symbols refer to, which in turn enables the primary development of the capacity to categorize, or to do the right thing with the right kind of thing. Even though the intervention of the soft into the world of the hard produces very sudden and far-reaching transformations, it is nevertheless highly predictable as an outcome of the work that work performs on itself in the interests of efficiency, or as it might alternatively be understood, work reduction or idleness. One might extend Ceres's principle that the hard moves to the soft to a brand name like Honest Toil Olive Oil. The oil is made by, or in the framework of, an English-Greek-Hungarian family from small-scale producers near Kyparissia in Messenia on the west coast of the Peloponnese. The company is at some pains to emphasize that the oil is not blended or filtered as other oils commonly are, meaning it really is as unadulterated as possible, simply squashed olives. I have no reason to doubt these claims, which are made against, and perhaps in response to, a background of suspicion that so-called pure olive oils are in fact subject to various kinds of ancillary process. Olive pressing has had a reputation for a long time as an epitome of laborious work designed to produce the reward of pleasure. Sometimes, as in the Jewish proverb that the olive must be squeezed to produce sweetness, it figures forth the lesson that suffering brings forth beauty or goodness. The pressing of olives provides an apt image for activities of destruction, digging, grinding, mixing, mashing, that themselves are transformed in work processes into a work of transformation. The long historical phenomenology of oil, imagined from the hygienic practices of the Greeks as that which cleans or purifies, especially if it is in the form of the fantasy of what are called essential oils, and is therefore accompanied by the counterimage of corruptive oil in the form of animal fats and greases, assists materially in the making of oils. Symbolic reputation. But the name honest toil performs a different kind of work, a work on the idea of work itself, substituting the soft play of sounds for the hard work of treading and squeezing, instead of the palpable work of pulping some physical mass. There is a minor work of modification that marks all the difference and seems to make it too the simple doubling of the dental that divides honest from oil with the little stutter or geminate T of honest toil. What the phrase also allows us to utter, in a pleasurable sort of reverberation, is the question of whether the act of transforming honest oil into honest toil is itself honest or not. The little jolt of pleasure at the joke is a sort of magical honey sort qui mal vi pens inhibiting anyone who might suspect trickery. However, oil, which not only binds and preserves but slips and slides, is associated with guile as well as toil, the greasing of palms and the buttering up of superiors, as indicated by Cordelia's revulsion from the work of flattery indulged in by her to sisters to gain the favor of their father layer, in affirming I want that glib and oily art to speak and purpose. Not. In the last 2 centuries or more, a definitional perturbation has arisen in relation to the idea of work. From the beginning of the 19th century, it has begun to be suspected, suggested, and then finally openly proclaimed That there is a special kind of work that represents the transcendence of work into contrary senses, that is, it is both a transcendent form of work and a disturbing transcendence of it. This special, magic kind of work is known as art. During the course of the 19th century, it became common to contrast art to what is called craft, where art signifies a sort of ennobled or transfigured form of craft. Craft is a derivative from the German Krafte, work, force. Its physical sense survives in the word graft. To dig, and by transference we must assume, to labor or toil. But craft has become crafty, just as, in American slang, the drift of graft through ablout. Modification into grift implies the work of theft or trickery. The meaning of work for human beings and the question of its authenticity or seriousness is poised between engineering and ingenuity, doing things and not exactly doing things, to evoke the field of inquiry that J. L. Austin mock seriously marked out for future essay at the end of his essay pretending. Indeed, the Proto-Indo-European root *quer, to make or do, shows a tendency to generate words that are both an intensification and an inversion of the idea of work, implying a kind of trickery. Examples include the Lithuanian karety, bewitch, enchant, and Russian kari, magic, and karovati, enchant or charm. This drift, unless perhaps it is a drive from honesty to deception, is at work in other words, for example in the word design, which names the special kind of work involved in planning or preparing a work. In his essay about the word design, William Flusser points out that, in English, design has connotations of cunning and deceit. To design is to have designs or be designing, just as to be an artist is to be artful, and there is artifice in every artifact. The suspicion attaching to artifice seems to have been slow to develop. Charles II praised Christopher Wren's design for St. Paul's Cathedral when he saw it 1675, among diverse designs which have been presented to us. We have particularly pitched upon one, as well because we found it very artificial, proper, and useful, as its pairing with propriety and utility makes clear. Charles II's praise of Wren's artifice does not yet imply artfulness. Flusser's Aristotelian example of design trickery is the lever by means of which we might be able to lift ourselves to the stars. This is the design that is the basis of all culture, to deceive nature by means of technology, to replace what is natural with what is artificial and build a machine out of which there comes a God who is ourselves. But Flusser ends his essay on the word design with an abrupt swivel, which, though disconcerting, is highly characteristic of his writing. In his final paragraph, he acknowledges that he might have taken a completely different track than to expose the cunning and deceptive aspects of the word design. He might, he assures us, have pursued another design by explicating the word in terms of its relation to signs, omens and tokens, a sign of the times, a sign of things to come, a sign of membership. Flusser's conclusion that everything depends on design therefore leaves us uncertain which aspect of designing deception or designation is to the fore, and what kind of designs he might turn out to have on us, and to have as his object in the essays that follow. Flusser may mean simply that everything depends on design, or that everything depends on what kind of thing design is taken to be on the design, so to speak, of design. Flusser's essays on technology will also be repeatedly pricked by the suspicion that it may be the things we design, or even the act of designing itself, that have designs, or are designing. The philosophy of design is to be given from Wormstand der Dinge, the state, condition or standpoint of things, or even, recruiting the German expression Stand Worm, dating from, or as of this date, moving forward from, and through, things. One of the most conspicuous of the disjunctures in Flusser's The Shape of Things is that between the deceptiveness of design and the question of the ethics of design, but this recurring question also acts as the generative principle of Flusser's Philosophian process of the process of design. The association between deceit and designation in design points us to what is often regarded as a stark and absolute contrast between the physical order of masses, forces and motions, and the symbolic order of words, ideas and images. The simple word form slips with, or like, a passepartout between these two realms, between the world of physical form and the mental world in which the abstract form of those forms is articulated. Form belongs both to the world of matter, the world in which everything must take physical form, and the mental world of abstract categories, which interpret the form of forms. But physical form is itself a formal and not a physical category. The nowadays ubiquitous word information begins by meaning not knowledge or the transmission of what has previously been given a form, but the very act of shaping or forming itself, that of which you are informed very often in early usages. The gospel, or revelation of divine truth, has the effect of reforming you, or imparting to you a new form. When, in his 1387 rendering of Ranulph Higden's Polychronicon, John Trevisa writes that 5 books come down from heaven for information of mankind, the informing effect of the information imparted is surely understood as a transformation. In John Ligett's affirmation of 1484 that Christ was all by reason as I pursue first profit by information, the two meanings of imparting information and taking on physical form or incarnation are similarly held in exquisite balance. That Christ's incarnation has often been understood as an enactment of his role in the Trinity, as the executive force of doing or implementation is indicated by the fact that he is referred to as the Word, translating Greek logos, word, reason, logic. It is tempting to believe that a word like logos, which means both an order and the ordering that it effects, derives from a time in which doing things was not so clearly distinguished from saying them or saying that you are going to do them. Such a time would be characterized by the magical thinking in which saying and making so are the same. But, while magical thinking has proved to be impossible to eradicate completely from human thought, it is hard to conceive of any human beings who could ever have been both possessed of language and unaware of the defining difference between a word and a work. The long centuries of doctrinal agonizing over how Christ could be both consubstantial with God and yet also represent Him as His earthly lieutenant or agent of His agency, may be seen as wrangles over the nature of the work done by God. Indeed, they might even suggest that the idea of God or of divinity may be understood as a sacralization or apotheosis of work itself. This might go some way to explaining the rather strange fact that religious belief should itself be characterized by so many duties, constituting a veritable service industry of observance. If the idea of God is an idealization of the idea of work, then it would seem appropriate, though in no sense literally required, that the worship of that principle should be an opus Dei, a project of exacting, if also joyous, work. As we have seen, it is Thomas Carlyle who articulates most clearly and emphatically the principle of the gospel of work. Properly speaking, all true work is religion. Older than all preached gospels was this unpreached, inarticulate, but ineradicable, forever enduring gospel, work, and therein have well-being. In one sense, this gets things precisely topsy-turvy, since it is work that is the object of worship, rather than its means. But in another sense it intimates the centrality of a work transcendental to every religious conception and practice, making them all religions of work. For much of human history, it is the physical world that has been understood as the domain of work. Work, Michel Serres has suggested, is identical with the realm of space, which takes its form from being conceived and lived as a workplace. Euclidean space was chosen in our work-oriented cultures because it is the space of work of the mason, the surveyor, or the architect. Hence the cultural idea of the practical origins of geometry, that is a tautology, since the only recognized space is precisely that of work, of transport. We will leave aside for a moment, but a short moment only, the strangeness of the fact that such a space of pure work, of weight moved through a distance in the classical definition, must, in order to be workable, tractable, operable, be governed by an abstract, weightless space of shapes, lines, weights and measures. The practice of art is still routinely represented, and surely by many experienced, as the opposite of earning an honest living. This practice is vitiated, however, by the fact that we seem to be running out of examples of classical delving, spinning, sweat of your brow, honest toil. In 2019, David Graeber published an influential lamentation on the vacuity of the occupations he calls bullshit jobs, which suggested that ever more employees in different areas of capitalist economies thought they were employed in a bullshit job, defined as a form of employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. Just as one might expect, the phantasmatics of work include literary and artistic representations of the act and fact of working, in which some of the peculiarities of the relation between work and art come into view. Literary works in particular have been drawn on heavily to assist and particularize the sociological imagination. But although there are certainly kinds of illumination to be gained about the lives of weavers, peasants, tinkers, clerks, washerwomen, merchants, and even writers from works of art, we should be struck nevertheless by how allergic works of art tend to be to the representation of the work that these kinds of workers actually do. Work is strangely invisible in literary work. The strangeness of its invisibility derives from the fact the proofs and manifests of work are everywhere, but the work of work withdraws itself as work comes into the foreground. This means in particular that work processes tend to be represented in symbolic or abbreviated ways. The factory scene in a film always begins shortly before the siren goes for a lunch break, therefore defining work by the transition to non-work. Despite efforts to increase viewer absorption by seeming to obey the classical unities, the deliberations in a courtroom drama are constantly being broken into by cries of "court adjourned." When Dickens attempts to characterize the work of the blacksmith's forge in Great Expectations, it is through transposition into the rhythmic motif of the work song "Beat It Out, Old Clem." We may say that despite being drawn to the idea of work, the formal phantasmatics of art and literature are unable to keep work practices steadily in view. Despite being constantly adjured or summoned to appear, the actuality of work is constantly being adjourned, literally put off to another day. When work is put on the stage, as at the end of George Bernard Shaw's Mrs. Warren's Profession, it marks a transition away from any kind of dramatic action. Throwing away a letter that might represent a change to her life, Vivi goes to her work with a plunge and soon becomes absorbed in her figures. Showing somebody really working as opposed to working is equivalent to the act of turning on the light in dreams, an action that is always prevented or displaced in some way by the dream work whose job it is to keep the sleeper asleep. Since turning on the light betokens awakening, artists have often been accused of indolence, but it seems to be art itself that is constitutionally work-shy. The reason may be simple. Works of art may be about work but are in some dimly intuitive way expected to be means of distraction and recuperation from it. Works of art are not supposed themselves to be work at the consumption end. At the same time, though, works of art have found it impossible not to image themselves in the practices of work they depict, even though this may seem always to hint at the troubling suspicion that artistic work may not really be work at all. As a professor of English, I used often, in high-level academic management meetings, to find myself putting up with withering accusations from my opposite numbers in the sciences that they were subsidizing are theological tomfooleries with their laborious laboratory work. One might distinguish the hard sciences from the soft humanities with the single letter E, which appears to have been added during the 17th century to laboratory to form the word elaboratory, and then trimmed off again those who work in what are now more sleekly called laboratories labor. The word seems to teach us to think, while others merely elaborate. On one notable occasion though, the commercializing pressure of student recruitment gave me the opportunity for spiteful revenge when the accounts we were reviewing seemed to suggest that in fact the Department of English, teeming with students and making the tills ring, was extending a very considerable cross-subsidy to the Department of Botany, in which the staff-student ratio was approaching a transcendental 1:1. Seizing my opportunity to turn the tables, I majestically inquired why the college should continue to maintain in existence a department that was so clearly incapable of paying its way. Because, Professor Connor, replied the master of the college quietly, we have mouths to feed in the Department of Botany. I cannot recall or relate the story, though I often do relate it, without a frisson of shame, and ever since have felt I had something to expiate. There are indeed mouths to feed, but they are fed by processes that ultimately are symbolic rather than in any obvious or straightforward way. Laborious. David Graeber offers as an epigraph to one of the chapters in Bullshit Jobs the following quotation, "In the Scilly Islands, the natives of that group are popularly said to have eked out a precarious livelihood by taking in each other's washing." He offers as a reference only obscure 19th century joke, though there seems no particular reason why he might not have given its 1876 source in a report of a lecture on the uses of a landed gentry, given in Edinburgh by J. A. Froude, though the phrase does not in fact occur in the text of Froude's actual lecture. Graeber's book is devoted to convincing us that such circumstances are so absurd that the requirement to work should be swept away by means such as a guaranteed universal income, an idea that is increasingly being seriously discussed in a number of different countries. It seems much more likely that the point of work may be precisely to disguise this absurdity. The fact that the pretense of working is itself a kind of ordeal, privation or exploitation may be proof of the importance of ensuring that work is indeed hard, even, and in fact especially, when it is not particularly so. This is perhaps part of the reason why the peculiar practice, or rather, perhaps, the peculiar category of practice, known as art has got mixed up with the question of difficulty. Just at the point, from the late 19th century onwards, at which artists started to react testily against the expectation that their work required special kinds of skill or laboriously acquired technique, and began to insist that art in fact embodied the ideal of transcending vulgarly laborious craft, and just as the suspicion began to grow that the forms of modern art they produced did not really make many demands at all on their time or technique, so a set of occult beliefs began to be brewed about the special kinds of spiritual vocation and striving that were needed to be a modern artist. In fact, a special charisma had begun to be accorded to the figure of the artist from the Renaissance onwards, but from the late 19th century onwards the visionary power thought to be possessed by the artist began to be transferred to his or her products, which acquired their value not from the qualities of verisimilitude, beauty, absorptiveness and so on that had previously been readily recognizable by their audiences, but from the evidence they supplied of being the outcome of particular kinds of work that no longer seemed to be governed by accepted aims or techniques. In lockstep with this, the audiences for modern art were persuaded that their own responses needed ever more elaborate training, not least in the huge expansion of courses of academic study devoted to the understanding and interpretation of the different kinds of art that multiplied during the 20th century. Increasingly, the point of a work of art was not to supply pleasure, but rather to furnish difficulty, even if that difficulty was grimly expected to constitute a new kind of pleasure. Up until the end of the 18th century, making art had been thought to be hard, in order that its reception should furnish a kind of ease. By the end of the following century, it was the reception of art that was turned into hard work. The work that goes into the fantasy of difficulty in modern art is acidly mocked by John Carey in the course of his remarks on the case made by John Tusa for increased government funding of opera. The fact is, he explains, that opera is not like dipping into a box of chocolate. It is demanding, difficult. Despite this assurance, the association of opera with difficulty seems questionable. What sort of difficulty, it might be asked, do those attending operas encounter? What is difficult about sitting on plush seats and listening to music and singing? Getting served at the bar in the interval often requires some effort, it is true. But even that could hardly qualify as difficult compared with most people's day's work. The well-fed, well-swaddled beneficiaries of corporate entertainment leaving Covent Garden after a performance and hailing their chauffeurs do not look as if they have been subjected to arduous exercise, mental or physical. Much 20th century art devoted itself to the paradoxical project of unworking or working art free from the structures and expectations of work, in particular through a refusal to produce what are known or recognized as works of art. One form of this refusal is the idea of the ready-made, as inaugurated in Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, a urinal signed R. Mutt submitted in 1917 to an exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in New York. Thereafter, it was open to artists to claim that their acts of choice, as dramatized by the displacement of objects from their familiar contexts into the context of the gallery, were enough on their own to make objects into works of art, or what increasingly would come to the same thing, objects of speculation as to whether they were in fact works of art or not. This is really a replay of J. C. Maxwell's conundrum of the working from home demon who might be able to perform work merely through the action of selection or sorting. It was only a matter of time before artists would realize that there was no need for any kind of work-like object to act as a bait or decoy, since the very act of conceiving or projecting various sorts of actions or procedures might itself be regarded as artwork. The surprise is that it did in fact take almost half a century for what is called conceptual art to emerge, first of all in the USA and then in Europe. As Saul Levitt explained in 1967, when an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand and the execution is a perfunctory affair. As often as not, the execution is so perfunctory that it can safely and perhaps even preferably be left to others to carry out, making the artist a kind of designer or commissioner, and the artist's idea a machine that makes the art. Levitt does not go out of his way to suggest that the work of producing concepts is itself particularly hard work, and his statement concludes with the observation in a footnote that I dislike the term work of art because I am not in favor of work, and the term sounds pretentious. None of this could possibly have gone anywhere were it not for a peculiar kind of paradox that came to constitute the whole realm of art. Practice, or, since the point is that the practice is arbitrary and incidental, what we must call the mythos of art. On the one hand, the purposes, process, and effects of art became increasingly self-determining, that is, meant to demonstrate the capacity of art to make of itself what it liked. Seen somewhat more expansively, one might also say that the point of a work of art seemed increasingly to be to dramatize the question of what kind of work it actually was, often by teasingly hinting that no work of any recognizable kind, brushwork, say, might have been involved at all. One might expect such a project quickly to have diminished into nothingness, with the institutions and audiences of art drifting away to busy themselves with the many other modes of leisure and distraction that began to be provided by new media and technologies. In fact, however, the dissolution of the traditional understanding of the kind of work that might go into making a work of art went along with a dramatic consolidation of the power, fascination and prestige of the idea of art, as embodied especially in the theory that the sphere of art involved access to a special kind of experience or world within a world called the aesthetic. Nothing proved the distinctness of the idea of the aesthetic, a term that in much common usage seems to mean simply being artness, more than the apparent ordinariness of the kinds of thing presented as art: supermarket items, bricks, blocks of wood, light bulbs, empty rooms, unmade beds and so on. Limitlessly, for what possible limit could there be to the capacity of art to turn non-art things into art things? The galleries, museums and concert halls that had previously existed to contain or make available the specific and distinctive kind of artwork that were the precipitates of the work putatively done by artists now became arenas for the performance of a special kind of work of vague musing on, or, as it was sometimes sternly called, interrogation of the nature of the work involved in art. It has been drearily clear for at least a century that art can be anything. Any kind of object, any kind of action whatsoever. But this does not in the least imply that anything can be art, since in order to be art, remembering of course, that being art is identical with being taken to be art, or being taken to be the kind of thing that other people would be likely to take to be art. And so on, some kind of claim, assumption or assertion needs to be made regarding the artistic status of the object or action in question. Being art depends on the magical operation of framing or put-up job that is necessary to turn an artistic object into art. And it is hard to deny that some kind of work, or at least some sort of operation, must have occurred or be able to be assumed to have occurred in this process. Work and operation overlap almost completely in the range of their usages in English. It is hard to avoid the fancy that this operation is to be located somewhere between the heaving and straining of work and the fancier kind of thing, both more elaborate and also more rarefied, that the Latinate operation might more often seem to mean, as for example in a military operation or a surgical procedure. For more than half the time that art has been assumed to be able to be anything, that operation has been able to be discursive or institutional discursive, as well as physical, that is, the soft kind of transformation effected by Maxwell's neat-fingered entity of designating something as art, or declaring it to be so, or perhaps even just floating the possibility that it might be art or not. You decide. This process is at once wholly imaginary and completely real. What is more, it is wholly imaginary and completely real in just the same way as work is. By seeming to be the opposite of work, the work of art succeeds in being functionally identical with it. Art is whatever succeeds in being imagined to be art, in just the same hey presto way as work is whatever succeeds in being imagined to be work.